All right, thank you everyone for having me here today. Today I'm going to be talking about the evolution of the mobile web. I'm Adam, I'm the project lead of Ionic framework, and there's a lot of cool stuff for us to be talking about with Ionic, like ahead of time compiling, server-side rendering, 60 frames per second native scrolling and animations, progressive web apps, and there's so much more. But this conference already saw a lot of these great talks, so instead, I'd like to mix it up a little bit and talk about cars. Now, not many people know that I'm actually a huge car buff. As long as I can remember, I've loved automobiles. I've enjoyed working on them with my dad and my brother, going to car shows, reading every magazine imaginable about the latest and greatest automobiles. And in doing so, I've come to really enjoy its history and how it changed the world. Sadly, I didn't make it as a race car driver, so naturally the next step is software development. And like all of us, I got to witness firsthand the creation and the refinement of the web. So I'd like to take this opportunity to go over a quick history lesson about cars. So there's a story here that I really want to tell that I feel runs parallel to what we share with the software industry. Both automobiles and the web made the world smaller. But how did we get to develop what a car is? Take a look at this car here, right? It's a 1901 Oldsmobile. It's credited as being the first mass-produced car. Now, there are some recognizable features, like there's 4 wheels and a seat, right? But it doesn't at all look like the cars that we drive today. However, the early 1900s was still an incredibly exciting time for the automobile industry. At one point, Detroit, USA had nearly 300 car startups. Really, Silicon Valley is like the Detroit from 100 years ago. Now take a look at these cars and how they're designed, their form, their function. It's all over the place. This era is where I feel the internet was before the global popularity of the World Wide Web. Because remember, the internet and the web are not necessarily one and the same. And as the web began to really explode in the 90s, web development went through kind of the same growing pains, just as the automobile industry did. So how did we ever get from this to this? Well, I'd like to argue that it all began with Ford's Model T, which was the most influential car of the 20th century and really the first global car. Remember, this is at a time when everyone was taking guesses as to what a car was, right? With the development of the assembly line and being able to build 15 million Model Ts worldwide, other manufacturers around the globe were able to quickly learn how to mass-produce cars. The Model T was important because it defined the best practices of how to build a car, how they look, and how they work. But what really made it important was how accessible the Model T was, because the prices continually dropped, and many families were now able to become car owners. This is ultimately what changed the world, but there's still more to it. This is also a time when the world didn't have global standards for nuts and bolts. Today, we all take it for granted. At first glance, a bolt may seem like something that just holds things together, but if you dig a little bit deeper and take a look at its details, like its thread pitch, the angle, the depth, all these things needed to be standardized by somebody. Now imagine if each company used their own thread pitch. Nothing would be interchangeable. Thankfully, the world worked together to develop the metric system. And yes, even all American cars have metric fasteners. I can travel to any country today, and with the same toolbox, I can fix a Japanese, European, or American car with the same tools. This fact alone is often overlooked, but it's a huge advantage for all of us. So with the Model T, there finally was a successful, repeatable model for others to build upon and iterate on. And over time, it established the global standard for structure, look and feel, and function of an automobile. So all right, I lied a little bit. We're not just going to be talking about cars. Who knows what this is? Who recognizes this? All right, got a couple hands, right? Well, this is our Model T. The era of the Model T is like our introduction of the World Wide Web. There was finally a global standard that was accessible to the masses. And in case you're wondering, this is the Mosaic browser, somewhere around 1993. Now, there are some recognizable features here, like it's got back buttons and a reload button, but it doesn't at all look like the browsers we use today. And these are the nuts and bolts that the world standardized: HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Now, it's easy to analyze and pick apart these well-defined languages now, but they didn't always exist. These languages were developed from loose ideas that were sometimes vaguely resembling other loose ideas. And somehow, some way, they evolved into something that's tangible today, and the entire world is standing upon it. Now look what happened in the automobile industry. Notice how much change has occurred since the Model T. Despite it being wildly successful, the world wasn't done yet, and cars evolved through natural selection. New businesses, concepts, ideas, all began building on top of the standards that were well-defined, and the world has been forever changed. And automobile manufacturers were learning from one another to build better cars, which in the end benefited you and I. And the web saw something similar. We saw some pretty cool tools that took the basic building blocks of the web and really pushed the limits of what it could do. Great ideas came from these early tools, which were built using simple HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And some of these are still widely used today. I mean, in fact, I remember the first time that I used jQuery at work and being completely blown away by what it could do. It made my job easier, and it offered ideas which I would have never thought of on my own. And if you were playing around with front-end web development back then, you probably had that jQuery moment too. I really do think that many of the popular frameworks today would not be nearly as advanced if it wasn't for these early tools. And the same goes for the standards. Many of our modern APIs today came out of great ideas from the open source community that helped define what we needed. So let's get back to automobiles, shall we? There was also a lot of crazy ideas too, right? Individual companies experimented with what they thought would work and would be interesting. Some of them were actually kind of cool ideas, but chances are nobody here drives cars like any of these. And if you do, please come find me after this talk. I would love to meet you. And well, the web, they actually saw something similar. You recognize these? All right, so there's a collective laughter and groan here, so that should say a lot right there. The common theme of these technologies is how the company's logo is proudly displayed next to the proprietary software. The common denominator here is that it's closed software controlled by one company. Each of these decided not to use the global standard, and each required a custom runtime, and developers were forced to use their IDE. And if history repeats itself, just these logos alone says a lot about what happens when one company attempts to reinvent a global standard and own it for themselves. The reason why we proudly use web technologies and standards is because it's not owned by anyone. With the web, an often overlooked benefit is that board members do not have the ability to leave you and your users high and dry if quarterly profits aren't high enough. So okay, back to cars again. Let's fast forward a little bit. Basically, the car industry figured out what worked, what didn't work, and through all of that, we now know what a car is. We were able to build on top of the ideas of the successes and the failures, and focus then shifted into running tests, optimizing, engine refinement, size modifications, and safety improvements. And each company still continues to learn from one another, and again, it benefits you and I. You and I, as car drivers, can simply turn the key and drive away. We are the users, but for the most part, we could care less about the specifics of how a car works. We just want it to work and to have a good experience. In the software industry, I really believe that we've now hit that era of we know what a web application is. Each of these technologies, at their core, use the global standards of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to push software development forward with newer, better ideas. And the best part is, we can all use them. Framework authors are optimizing their code for the performance of the slowest browser they support. But because standard building blocks of the industry, and because of this, they're using the standard building blocks of the industry. They're already tracking the best practices for performance, which your project can automatically receive. And yes, if you're building an extremely large application with a large, experienced team, and I emphasize application and not a web page, you can certainly roll your own from scratch. But let's be honest, that may not always work. The point is, Frameworks allows your team to focus on building a great application that scales, rather than requiring every team member to know everything about everything as software evolves. And again, I say fully functioning application, not informational static web page. That's a different story. But I can hear it already, okay? Frameworks are bad and you should never use them, right? Honestly, if you've heard that mantra before, there's a good chance that the person saying that may not have ever had a practical use case for one. They may not have been a part of a project that lasted for many years with many different developers working on it. Here we are a century past the mass production of automobiles, and we all know exactly what a car is. But for some reason, there isn't one true automobile. The road isn't filled with millions of the same cars that have the same size, shape, and color. In fact, there are countless examples of the various automobiles we use today. And like in this picture here, you wouldn't take a dump truck to compete at the racetrack, just like you wouldn't take a race car to the construction site. Each has their own purpose and their use case. And we see all these wonderful thought pieces all the time on Hacker News and Medium. Yes, a certain technology may not have made sense for that author, and we get to hear all about it, right? But there is no one true use case for web development, just like there's no one type of automobile. I think this point can be sometimes forgotten, and this helps illustrate kind of the silliness it can be sometimes. Sometimes it's hard not to get caught up into the soap opera that is web development. It can be fun, but it's also very exhausting. If there's one thing I want to get across, that there's absolutely going to be times where you should not use a framework. I've personally built many websites with just HTML and CSS. But the seasoned developer understands their use case, is able to do their own critical thinking of when and when not to use a certain tool. So here's my advice. Don't be fooled by backseat developers. If you fully understand your use case, then you and your coworkers already have the data to solve your problem. So, all right, sorry about that. I went on my little rant there. So let's bring it all back to cars again. Standardization of the automobile really has benefited us all. But imagine if only BMWs could drive on one type of road and Mercedes on the other type of road. How messed up would that be? You'd have to own every type of car just to get where you wanted, and have a special mechanic for each car you own. That'd be extremely redundant and expensive. The web and its core technologies allows any car to go down any road. It's a standard, and it's available to everyone. And it's for all of us to drive and to develop on. Right. So, okay, now I know what you're thinking. I get it. I see the vision of the web. I see its value. You know what? I kind of agree with you, Adam. But the mobile web just isn't ready. Well, however, I'd like to argue otherwise. For the last 3 years, I've spent a bulk of my professional time creating and developing Ionic framework. And even before that, I was building e-commerce websites with jQuery Mobile. Basically, I've been working on the lowest levels of the mobile web for quite a long time now, becoming familiar with the browsers and the devices of each era. And in my experience, I've witnessed firsthand just how much the mobile web has drastically improved since Ionic was created, which was about 3 years ago. It was once unheard of to build a desktop application within a browser. Imagine building Gmail or Google Maps as a single-page application in Netscape 2 or Internet Explorer 3. But now desktop web apps are commonplace. This same transition has happened on mobile. There have been incredible advancements in our day-to-day devices. And I'm not just going to say stats from the latest and greatest phone, like the iPhone 7 or even the new Google Pixel phone, which is insanely fast and giving Apple a run for their money. Rather, let's look at phones that are already 3 years old, like the iPhone 5S. Now, the 5S, which was released in 2013, has a dual-core 1.3 gigahertz CPU. This phone, mind you, it's 3 years old, has a CPU which is comparable to desktop CPUs from a decade ago. And in just 3 years, the internal memory on common devices has completely doubled to when Ionic just started. And the same stats can be said about Android. In fact, you can buy a brand new unlocked Android phone for $60 on Amazon that has a quad-core 1.3 gigahertz processor and 4 gigabytes of memory. And modern browsers are looking better than ever. In the good old days of IE6 and IE8, when browsers just lingered and they wouldn't die, it was difficult for the web to move forward. But let's face it, many of us don't even know what browser we're even using because we don't need to. They're now all self-updating, and they iterate so quickly that browser version just doesn't matter like it used to. On mobile, the analog here would be the Android browser, Android browser, which is the default browser of Android 4.3 and below. It just wouldn't go away. I still like to say it's like the IE6 of mobile. But like desktop, mobile has matured and now has the vast majority of devices have a modern browser. Again, this wasn't the case when Ionic started. Android's web view, which is now Chromium web view, has been auto-updating since Android 5. And Apple consistently ships updated versions of Safari. And another important point is that these browsers are all running the same engines that you use on desktop. Again, not the case that it used to be. Amazing developer tools come with the browser out of the box. I remember all the hacks, all the testing hacks I had to put into Ionic 1 just to see what Android was doing. And I had to use window alert by far more times than I'd like to admit just to understand what's going on inside that browser. But we're past that now. We're now able to plug it in. We can see exactly what's going on inside the browser. And it's great to be past this. This is an amazing time. And not only has browser debugging and rendering improved, but browsers have made massive improvements to JavaScript engines as well. Modern JavaScript engines do just-in-time compiling down to executable bytecode. And on top of that, JavaScript itself has literally leveled up. It has applied modern programming APIs seen in other popular languages. And JavaScript itself is fundamentally changed for the better. And remember that slide about proprietary software installing custom runtimes? Well, let's face it. JavaScript no longer is the bottleneck it once was. And it's no longer a toy. It's fast. It's a standard. And it's everywhere. And the standards themselves have made massive improvements. These are just a few of the APIs that are now widely available that weren't in the past and have made a huge impact. With the touch action CSS property, we can now remove that 300 millisecond delay, and that gave the perception that mobile was slow. And if you remember, the original web was simply about linking scientific documents together. So browsers were not concerned about dynamic data and unnecessary reflows and repaints. But with CSS containment, we're now able to narrow it into just the elements that are affected and not waste resources repainting the entire document all the time. And scroll jank has always been a topic. But with passive event listeners, it's even easier to let the browser continue to do its smooth scrolling and not let your application code get in the way. And request animation frame. That's been around for a while now on desktop, but it really hasn't been until recently that mobile devices didn't need to be polyfilled by set timeout, which once again, thank you, Android browser. And on that note, Ionic now uses native browser scrolling rather than JavaScript scrolling, now that browsers have fixed their issues with scroll events. Even hardware-accelerated animations have been around for a while, but they weren't widely available. Now you can be confident in getting those 60 frames per second animations. The point is, today's bottlenecks are not the same that they were 3 years ago. The web has made massive leaps in performance, and a lot of it has to do with the simple fact that web apps are built using technologies that have simply upgraded themselves. The lowest common denominator is a very capable device with a modern and frequently updated browser that follows the standards and has fast JavaScript engines. Even the bottleneck of updating the DOM has been solved by modern frameworks. For example, Angular 2 is able to render 5 times faster than Angular 1. Now, the network itself is the bottleneck. Poor or no connectivity is where web apps often suffered. But now with cool new APIs like service workers, you can give your web apps offline capabilities. Look, the web is the largest, most open, most collaborative platform in the history of software development. And by the way, it's made a lot of people a lot of money. If there was ever a time to invest in the web, it's now. The value of your skill set continues to go up, and the opportunities have expanded. You and your team already have the skills. Web technologies are already being taught in high schools, and even grades younger than that. And I love hearing about how easy it is for all members of the team to contribute to their app's development at the same time. Back-end and front-end engineers and web designers can all be working on their corner of the application at the same time because of how web apps are able to separate concerns through HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And not one company controls the stack. like countless other technologies that have come and gone. What you learn today, you can still use tomorrow, and the web will still be installed on your device. In fact, web technologies run on trillions of devices. Think of Adobe Flash and how you needed Flash Player installed for it to work. And when Apple decided not to include Flash Player in the iPhone, many developers were left scrambling. And with the web, that standard runtime is available everywhere, and for the most part is self-updating. Try uninstalling the web. It's just there, but we take it for granted. It's installed on desktops, laptops, tablets, phones, televisions, wearable devices, and the web platform is even installed in cars. Since 2013, Tesla has been installing web browsers, and Ford, BMW, Volvo, Toyota, Lexus, they're all shipping with web browsers installed. So what does this really mean? Cars are being shipped with that standard runtime that you already know how to develop on. With the web platform, your same code base can ship on iOS, Android, desktop applications, web applications, and your car. The same code base. This is an extremely, extremely exciting time to be a web developer. We are the first generation to build scalable web apps. We're building the engines, we're defining the nuts and bolts, we're creating the standards that has allowed us to build web apps that have been never imagined. You are defining the software development for the next generations. This is why I'm so excited to be here and to be a part of all this. You know, I'm extremely proud of what the open source community has been able to accomplish in developing Ionic and the nearly 3 million apps that have been created with it. 3 million apps with Ionic. Extremely proud of that. But what I'm most proud of is how it's used web technologies at its core. Its ability to take advantage of the web platform, and its ability to be deployed on countless devices. So I genuinely hope that you learned something about cars today, and maybe something about the web too. So thank you for letting me share my story. Thank you.